On tonight's Live with Littlewood, have voters changed their colours on both sides of the pond? Can Boris Johnson level up Britain? And what should free marketeers make of the Queen's speech? All of that coming up on tonight's show. Welcome to this week's episode of Live with Littlewood, with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Coming up on tonight's show, we'll ask if Boris's levelling up strategy will be a roaring success. Indeed, what is his levelling up strategy? We'll also ask whether now is the time to pile on the pounds so we can get a paycheck from the government's Fit Miles scheme. And we'll be looking at this and other aspects of the Queen's speech and be asking what should free marketeers be making of them. That's all a little later. But first up, are we seeing a seismic shift in voter behaviour both here and across the pond in the United States of America? And what does it mean? We're calling this section The Great Divide. And to help me make sense of the shifts in voter patterns and public opinion, I'm joined by two very good friends on the other side of the pond, Terry Kibbe, Chief Executive Officer at Free the People, and Michael Carnuccio from Oklahoma. Michael, Terry, how the very devil are you both?
Well, I'm still stuck here in the swamp that's known as Washington, D.C., so I could be better. But last week, I was in the free state of Texas, actually talking to a live audience of 180 people. It was pretty liberating.
Wow, that's, first time for months. And Michael, how are you? How's the great state of Oklahoma?
The Wild West is fantastic. My children have been in school all year since last August. We have been open and free, much to the chagrin of some, but much to the benefit of our economy and many of the people here in our state.
Okay, guys. Well, I want to be asking you whether things that seem to be happening in terms of voter behaviour on this side of the pond are pretty similar in some ways to what's happening on your side of the pond. So we had local elections and some national elections here in the UK last week, which saw some fascinating results. The Conservative Party gained an MP in Hartlepool for the first time ever. But at the same time, the Conservatives lost ground to both Labour and the Liberal Democrats across the south, including the mayoralties of the west of England and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And the Conservatives were going backwards in some of the rich, leafier areas of the UK. Is this proof of a fundamental shift in the type of voter behaviour supporting the major parties? And it seems a similar realignment appears to be rippling across the Western world. Perhaps most notably over on your side of the pond in the US, where the Republicans' presidential victory in 2016 was by and large based on the support of working class white voters. And I was trying to look at things that might have predicted back in the 2016 presidential election, what sort of indicators were there about whether you were going to go for Trump or go for Clinton. And there's all sorts. Do you live in a rural area or do you live in a city area? Are you a practicing Christian or not? Age, gun ownership. But I'm told that the biggest predictor of whether you were going to vote for Trump was whether you were a fan of the World Wrestling Entertainment. That actually seemed to be the biggest signifier that you might actually vote Republican. In our general election back in 2019, 48%, nearly half of, we categorised them on this side of the pond as C2DE voters, basically blue-collar voters, supported the Conservatives. Only a third supported Labour. In that same election, 43% of university graduates voted to the left for Labour, and just 29% of university graduates voted for the Conservatives. The one seat gained by the Labour Party off the Conservatives here in the last general election was Putney in West London. The average house price in Putney is £821,000. In the seat that the Conservatives took, so lent to the right just last week, the average house price is £141,000. 53% of working class voters voted for Trump in 2016, just 39% voted for Hillary Clinton. Those without a degree voting Democrat has fallen from 51% back in 1996 to 28% last year, almost halved. That's people without a university degree. And over on your side of the pond, 34% of voters identify as independent, not Democrat or Republican. Terry, is something big happening here? When I were a lad, it was pretty clear what the divisions were in politics and what sort of factors would make you vote one way or another. Has that actually completely unraveled on both sides of the Atlantic? Is it unraveling in the States?
Well, I mean, I can't talk about what's happening in the UK, but I do think there is definitely a shift that's happening here in the US. As you mentioned, 34% of Americans now are registered independent. There are now more independents than registered Democrats and registered Republicans, and that is a seismic shift. Unfortunately, the Republicans and the Democrats control the voting process and the election, so it's very difficult for any third-party candidate to get elected. But I do want to bring up something that I think is really fascinating. In 2016, when Donald Trump was attracting the non-college degreed blue-collar workers, Hillary Clinton famously referred to them as the deplorables and just talked down about them. Yet it was that same demographic that helped get Bill Clinton elected president. And then he was very proud of his Bubba vote. So it's interesting to me how the Democrats now have truly become the party of the elite here, and the Republicans are now starting to represent the more blue-collar worker, middle-class people.
Michael, would you agree that that's the shifts that's happening in American party politics? I mean, it's not as if a new party has emerged. Same on this side of the pond. The parties have got the same names and the same legal infrastructures, but the base of support seems to have changed radically, both for parties on the right and parties on the left.
Well, I think so. And Mark, a couple of years ago when we were having this conversation, we would have been talking about the impact of populism. Is it good or bad, and the shifts that are happening in both of our countries. And I think that was part of the impact that you saw running into 2016 and after. There's this other interesting dynamic that happened here in the U.S. in the last election cycle, where you had many voters who had voted for Trump or were voting down the ballot favorable for Republicans, but there was this personal issue that they had with Trump, or that they grew with Trump, with the way he carried himself in the office, that it turned them off. And I think, and the reason I'm bringing that up, Mark, is you look at some of those demographics that you identified, where you looked at college education, or you looked at certain areas in wealth. Why are these people voting contrary to what would impact their pocketbooks? And we see this independently. I think you had that impact on some voters. And likewise, sometimes we forget and we don't think about the fact that those that are most impacted by the difference in the opinions of what you have between your conservative and labor parties, and we have Democrats and Republicans, we often think that someone who has wealth, has status, that they're going to vote in that direction. Well, sometimes they can deal with the nuisance that is government. But those blue-collar workers that are trying to break through, or that entrepreneurs trying to hit their first step and pull themselves up by the bootstraps, those are the ones that are most held back by many of the policies. And I think that's why you're seeing a shift there as well within the last 5 to 10 years.
And Terry, this sort of troubles me a bit as somebody who runs a think tank called the Institute of Economic Affairs. I mean, we're a strictly non-partisan outfit. We'll speak to any politician that will listen to us if they're interested in free market ideas. But is economics just no longer the big issue, Terry, that people are voting on, I don't know, identity or their views of culture or their stance on the flag or whatever? Terry, is it sort of, I mean, again, if I were to look back here, to the Thatcher era or the Reagan era, you know, what the tax and spending rate was sort of the big divide, with the left-wing parties, higher taxes, more spending, the conservative parties tending to advocate lower spending or at least lower taxes. Is that kind of for the birds now, Terry? Everybody's just sort of voting on issues of culture or identity rather than issues of economics? Well,
I think it's a combination of all of that. I mean, let's be honest, economics is not that exciting or interesting to most people, right? I mean, how many people's minds have been changed by a really awesome supply and demand curve, right? I think because of the prevalence of so many entertaining videos and YouTube and TikTok and Instagram Live and all of that stuff, that people are looking more to be entertained. And economics just doesn't entertain people. So I always go back to the way you can, economics is still important, but it's really about how you present it to the public. And you need to tell it, make it more interesting, make it more exciting. And I think that that's how you will get people to understand it. And unfortunately, people don't seem to care about economics right now because everything has been so good for so long. People don't think that the policies that the government is enacting is going to affect them in any way. It's just this big ephemeral concept. But when they're reading every day about race and culture wars and cancel culture, that's what gets people excited, because that's what, unfortunately, the media is stressing.
Michael, you were suggesting, you were alluding to in your opening remarks that there's maybe a difference now between the aspirational class and the affluent class. I mean, it seems here in the UK now, and I wonder if it's the same in the States, that there isn't much of a correlation between how much you're earning and what you think the income tax rate should be. You might think that rationally high earners would want the tax rate to be lower and lower earners would be less concerned about it. They're not paying as much tax, they're perhaps receiving more welfare. That seems to have flipped around now. Have we sort of got a class in the United States, because I think some would argue that we do here, who are we're so affluent, as Terry said, notwithstanding the last year being grim, you know, the world's become a lot richer over my lifetime, that they're almost the affluent people are almost indifferent to the tax rate. Doesn't really make much difference if their taxes go up 1 or 2%. Might even be, in economic terms, a positional good that allows them to virtue signal and maybe worth the entry price, right?
Certainly. I mean, if your overall net worth is growing 3%, 2%, 3%, 4% of GDP is going up, but then you have a 1%, 2% increase in your tax burden. Mark, I think there's two bigger issues at play, right? Number one, the United States, from the federal level, state, local, rather than just have it simply be a flat tax or a flat rate, right, or something that is easy to kind of have this conversation about, we have such a convoluted and compound tax system with so many incentives and credits and deductions. And the higher level of wealth that you are, you're going to have a team of accountants, or you're going to understand that and be able to play that game a little bit, where your tax burden might end up being less than someone who is in a different tax structure. I think that's one impact. And the other thing, Mark, to touch on, and look, Donald Trump was honest about this in 2016. This is why they wanted his tax returns, when he said, well, of course, they were available for me, so I used the system. Any smart business person would. If they wouldn't, you know, he kind of pointed that out. That I think answers this. And the other thing quickly that I just touch on that goes into this topic and what Terry touched on, in the United States, our educational system is not focusing on economics. It's focusing on culture. In college, you are now, as a freshman, not required to take an economics class, but you will be required to fill out a privilege test, and you will be required to go through university-sanctioned diversity training, right? And so what we're doing with every new voter that we're bringing in, and as we're educating people, is this is what's important, and this is what you want to have a depth of knowledge on. But math is boring, get it out of the way, don't look at economics, don't worry about how it impacts you. And so why would we be surprised as we get more and more voters that are coming online that they don't, A, have a depth of knowledge, or B, have any correlation or focus on the impact of their life, yet they will be heightened in their awareness of cultural issues.
Terry, tell me this. You've been a long-standing supporter of the Libertarian Party, which is, I think, a story in itself of the barriers to entry in politics, right? That you know, if you look at how rarely political parties change in any part of the Western world compared to, say, the NASDAQ or the FTSE 100 or the Dow Jones, where you get turnover all the time, political parties seem entrenched. But where in the States should free market leaning classical liberal libertarian people be looking towards? Is the caucus for those sort of ideas substantial in the Republican Party, or small and diminishing? Is there anybody of those sort of views in the Democrats? I mean, mentioning earlier about Bill Clinton, I mean, you know, he was a relatively low tax president. And back in the day then you had, I think they were known as the Blue Dog Democrats, and a certain overlap between both sides of the aisle. Some Republicans that might be to the left of some Democrats who might be to the left of some Republicans. Has all of that ended? I mean, is the only hope you're holding out for us, Terry, that eventually the Libertarian Party gets from 1% to 2% to 3% to 5%, and in 30 elections time it's got a majority? Or is there support for any of our sort of ideas in either of the two big parties?
Yes and no. It's fascinating to me that Abraham Lincoln was the last third-party candidate to get elected in the United States. But before I answer the rest of your question, I do just want to bounce back quickly to the previous questions, because we were talking about economics and taxes, and we tend to focus on taxes and how does that affect people. And I think, everyone thinks the rich should pay more and that the poor shouldn't pay anything, and it's just this big picture that it doesn't seem to affect people at their pocketbook. But what we've been talking about, a small portion of us here in the US, is about this ridiculous rampant spending. Like the government is spending like drunken sailors, right? I mean, like 2 billion here, 2 billion here, it doesn't really matter. And a lot of us have been talking about inflation, and that's starting to happen. Gas prices are over $3 a gallon for the first time since 2004. Food prices are going up. So this is an opportunity for us to talk about economics in a way that people can relate to. People can relate to the fact that I just went to the grocery store and I just spent $200 when 3 months ago I spent $100. What's going on? So I think there's a way for us to tie this into personal stories for people in a way that they understand. I mean, everybody wants to tax the rich, right? I mean, it's ridiculous, but that's the general concept. But I think talking about inflation and how these other government policies affect individual people will make a difference. So going back to this question, there is a little bit of overlap between, well, there's libertarian overlap between all of the parties. Depending on who I'm talking to, I like to say that as a libertarian, I agree with Republicans on some issues and with Democrats on other issues. Or I could be having the exact same conversation with someone else, and I can say, well, as a libertarian, I disagree with the right on these issues, and I disagree with the left on these issues. But there is overlap. I think that both parties are, the Democrats right now, there's an overreaction to the Trump years, and the Trump years were an overreaction to a lot of things. And I think that things are going so far in either direction that, weirdly enough, the libertarian viewpoint is now more in the central, and we seem more rational and moderate than either party does. And I think that's an opportunity. And the Libertarian Party in itself is being smarter now, in that they're starting to focus on down ballot races. They're looking at city council races and county races and things like that, and building a bench so that at some point, hopefully in less than 30 years, we will have libertarians at the national stage.
Michael, what's your take? Where do people of a small state get the government out of our lives, get taxes down, let people make their own lifestyle decisions? Where do we see possible allies for that sort of philosophy in the United States of America? Is that still a large bulk of the Republican Party, or a diminishing minority of it?
Yeah, no, I think it actually is a large bulk of the population. Let me explain. There's a couple dynamics here to always factor in, as Terry was alluding to. Not since Teddy Roosevelt's effort with the Bull Moose Party, right, has there been such a strong lesson. You could argue Ross Perot's impact in the '92 election cycle, but that awareness is there. So if a particular faction or whatever gets loud before they independently stand, one of the parties will try to shift and ride that momentum. Okay, so why is this important? What we saw in the last year and a half, and we are still seeing Oklahoma today, home values have skyrocketed. If you list your house, it may sell within 24 hours or less, because the left coast and the east coast are of the United States are having people move out and move in for multiple reasons. But what I just met a couple the other day from Seattle, Washington, that moved into Oklahoma, and Oklahoma wasn't on their radar about 6 months ago. But there's multiple reasons of why, but they're looking to get out of a state that has over control from the state, and they're looking to get into open opportunity and where they can have more say over their lives. So I think that dynamic, remember in politics, the pendulum is always going to swing, and the further it swings one way, the faster it'll back the other way. I loved how Terry put it that, what we're seeing now is a reaction to the Trump administration, and Trump was a reaction to a lot of things, right? That's kind of that pendulum swing. And so I think we're starting to see these dynamics that will turn around and impact politics next couple of cycles. There's a lot of people in states that have been shut down whose governors are going to have a hard time getting elected this next cycle next year.
Terry, the key job of you guys on that side of the pond is to cheer up miserable Brits like me. You're perennial optimists about freedom and the future and all the rest of it, and we're the kind of miserablists and we're all going to hell in a handcart. But tell me this: one of the things I'm worried about, and it's difficult to exactly measure this trend on this side of the Atlantic, but it seems that the possible area or zone of state intervention just grows and grows and grows. A couple of weeks ago, we had the government, saying it would do whatever it takes to prevent a possible reorganization of our football leagues, for example. Whatever it takes, presumably including, nuclear strikes on various football stadia if necessary. There now seems to be virtually no human affliction in which people, the media, and politicians themselves don't come up with solutions. You'll never now hear a politician saying, well, that's all well and good, or I'm sorry to hear that, but that's no business of the state. Virtually every human affliction, the first point of call rather than the last point of call is, well, what's the government going to do about it? What's the state going to do about it? What plan do politicians have? Has that been a growing phenomenon in the States, or is it just us poor Brits who are afflicted with that?
No, it's happening everywhere. There's the great saying that says, never let a good crisis go to waste. And this pandemic has been just a perfect example of that. I mean, I have never seen such a overreach of government power from the CDC, which is in charge of health, issuing a statement that says you can't evict someone if they can't pay their rent. It's been pretty fascinating. And here in DC, our illustrious mayor shut down all of the restaurants for in-person dining over the holidays to keep us safe. Then January 6th happened, and the violence that happened at the U.S. Capitol. And so she then decided she didn't want anyone coming into the city for the inauguration. So she extended the shutdown of the restaurants through the end of January to keep people from coming into the city. And it to me was just such a perfect example of how the government has taken power because of this pandemic and is now finding other interesting ways to use it. But I think that there has to be, Michael just was talking about the pendulum swinging. Sorry. I think there's got to be backlashes. I mean, people are moving from these lockdown states into freer states. You see in California, the governor Newsom, who is going through a recall election, he may actually lose his office. He's just announced that he's going to give everyone in the state an extra $600 because he has all of this extra money left over from the federal bailout. So he's buying votes. And in a state where, unemployment is still so high, but people can't find people to take a job because they're getting paid more for unemployment. And I think when states start looking at the states that haven't locked down, like say Florida and Texas and Oklahoma, and start looking at how those economies are coming back, I think people will recognize that maybe government shouldn't control every single aspect of your life, that nothing good will come of it.
Michael, what's your take on that? Or are the great people of Oklahoma rather different to the rest, kind of get off my land and leave me alone? Is that the sort of feeling there? Or do you detect across the USA as a whole that there's a greater and greater tendency for every affliction to ask, what's the government going to do about it? I'm not saying the government should do nothing. I'm just saying that you name it now, there's virtually anything in human activity seems to be within their purview. What's your take on whether that's also the view in the States?
Well, I think it's a yes and answer, Mark, because on the one hand, yes, as Terry alluded, you do have pockets still, and you're still seeing the shift in dynamics where red is probably getting redder and blue is starting to trend bluer, or purple maybe trending bluer because of what we've experienced in the last year and a half. And I think that will continue. I don't know that Oklahoma is in some respects in that way unique with Texas, Florida, and others. In fact, if you did a straw poll today and Trump's name wasn't on it, Governor DeSantis for Florida is probably your leading contender going forward because of this dynamic. However, I'll go back to what I said before when you asked about economics. The same is true. Every generation that has been coming up in the United States has not been brought up as much as the previous generation in the bootstraps mentality.
Right.
You still have that in pockets, but more and by and large, through an education system and through just a public experience and indoctrination, you're bringing up this expectation that government is going to be there. I mean, how many kids and young people just watch their parents open multiple stimulus checks just out of the blue? And a lot of those families didn't need those stimulus checks. It was just a free check that came in from the government. And so that in and of itself is going to impact the psyche where that expectation is going to be there more and more. However, I will just throw this out. I think the reverse is true on the medical side. There is so much pushback because of the requirement of masks and how far you have to stand away. You cannot go to a restaurant or go into some place with customer service that somebody does not make a joke about why we both have a mask on and there's plexiglass between us. Neither of us can hear each other, so we take the mask off to talk so we can hear each other. I mean, that's everyday life experience. So I feel on the health side have a little bit more pushback.
We're going to be joined by another guest now. I want to move on to a different section of the program, but Michael and Terry, stay with us because I'm going to want your thoughts on this. We're calling this section level-headed, and we're going to be asking whether the Prime Minister can rebalance Britain or, in his terminology, level up Britain. And to help us discuss this, we're joined by broadcaster and commentator Calvin Robinson. Calvin, good evening to you. How are you, my friend? Have we got Calvin with us?
Oh, good evening. Can you hear me now? Good to be back.
Yeah, I can hear you now. You were on mute. That's the phrase of the last 12 months, right? That's been said more than happy birthday's been sung by far. But we can hear you loud and clear now. How are you, Calvin?
I'm fantastic. It's a pleasure to be back on your show.
Calvin, perhaps you can, I'm really using Terry and Michael here as a proxy. I was going to say, perhaps you can help explain to our friends on the other side of the Atlantic what levelling up is and what it means. But I'm going to be honest, I don't understand what it is or what it means. This has become the catchphrase of the UK government that we need to level up, which I guess is better than levelling down. Of course, it's well known that there are big differences in productivity across the country, big gaps between rich and poor, different levels of education. But Calvin, are you able to explain to me and our American friends dispassionately what is the levelling up strategy, meme, theme, discourse, or agenda?
Well, I love it personally. I'm a big video gamer myself, and it's a terminology straight out of video games. You level up to get a better position in the game. And what this means is making sure all of our left behind regions, the towns, the coastal areas. I'm from a former miners' town myself, so I know these places quite well. They've felt left behind for so long. And to be honest with you, this is a large part of what the Brexit vote was about. So this is the Tories' answer to that question of how are you going to maintain those voters who lent you their vote from Labour, those traditional working class voters that voted Tory in 2019 for the first time? How are you going to hang on to them? That's what this levelling up question is about. And practicalities of it, for me, mean devolution down to a local level, making sure that the money gets into the places that it should be and it's not dictated by Westminster. And we've seen some of this already, or attempts at this. They tried to move the BBC up to Manchester, which was not the most successful attempt because they moved the metropolitan liberal elite up there with them rather than hiring local talent. So that was counterproductive, but it's the start of something. We need to see real investment and real opportunities in the Midlands, in the North, and the coastal regions, and all around the country outside of London, to be honest with you, because it's been London-centric for far too long.
But Calvin, help me again here, and then I want to come back to our American friends to see whether they're these regional disparities are a big issue of contention in the States as well. Look, that sounds great. Who could be against it, right? The areas that have not done very well in the last 40 years, I'd love to see them do well. I'd love there to be more investment and whatever, everybody having a better life there. But what's the actual policy agenda for that? I mean, is that is that tax goes up on Londoners so more universities can be built in Hartlepool? Is that what what is done to achieve this? Or are we going to have enterprise zones? Are we going to have enterprise zones in the north of England? What's the actual tangible policies that we're likely to see?
So I think it's the opposite of building more universities. What we need to do is make more non-academic routes for people that don't want to go to university. So Tony Blair started this whole thing off where every single person has to go to uni. That's the only way you can succeed in life. And as we know, there are far more options available, and we need to have more vocational qualifications. So the T-level scheme was started, a bit of a non-starter actually, but it needs a bit more backing. We need to have alternatives to university. So the apprenticeship scheme, that's been a massive success. Different routes for 16-year-olds who want to make a living. And at the same time, we also need more academic options. So kids from working class backgrounds from these areas, coastal areas, etc., can get by and get into university. And a good way to do that is the grammar school program. I'm a great proponent of that, social mobility, giving people a hand up, not a handout, and helping those that are academically able to get into a good school, regardless of their postcode. Because for so long now in this country, schooling or comprehensive schooling on the state level has been down to where you live. And that means it's been selective by wealth. If your parents can afford to move to a better catchment area, you get to go to a better school, whereas those from disadvantaged backgrounds don't get that opportunity. So implementing more grammar schools would be fantastic, but we're at least seeing apprenticeship schemes increasing. We're seeing more vocational options such as T-levels and more routes where kids don't have to go to university. The government's also talking about bringing in extra funding for people that are more mature students, state funding for courses, more vocational courses. Where you fall on that matter, state funding, but more options for people that want to retrain is a good thing.
Michael, let me come back to you. Do you guys in the States agonize about these sort of regional disparities, whether, Nevada's doing better than New Mexico, or, how much richer is Massachusetts compared to Mississippi? Or because you've got a federal system, do people just move to where you like? You were sort of mentioning that people can move around, or Terry was mentioning can exit the states that they no longer find desirable. I think one of my favorite bumper stickers that somebody sent me from Texas was, by all means, move here from California, just don't bring California with you. Does the American political debate, Michael, have any of this does everybody sort of say, oh, this is absolutely terrible, Arkansas isn't doing as well as Georgia or whatever? Or do you see yourselves almost as sort of separate units and each in charge of your own destiny within the 50 states?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more of the latter in general. And unfortunately, I think the point that Captain mentioned there, that when you talk about the mobility that we refer to and we see happening, there is a class, a sector of the population, the economy that is not able to, they are not able to engage in that and have that level of freedom. We talk about that the most when it comes to school choice or education reform policies. We identify that there already is school choice for certain folks. It's called being wealthy and rich. What about the others, and why don't they deserve options as well? I don't know that has transcended all the way across, but I will say this, that I think this point we are going to be talking about next year and the year to follow as well, and that is the best way to create upward mobility is to get out of someone's way, to remove the barriers that exist. The more convoluted your tax code is, the more there has to be a relationship or privilege or opportunity with the state or with the federal government's blessing in order to have access to a particular market. Those are being felt and experienced by more and more people right now than we realize. And I think you're going to see the pushback that is just get off my lawn, get out of my way. And to Terry's point, we're not just going to see that from one political party, one political group. I think you're going to start to see that.
Terry, before I say goodbye to you, good evening from you here, or good morning to you over there. What's the take on this in the States? Is there a sort of healthy competition? Is Virginia, accelerating past Florida? Or is there a sort of agonizing about which states at the, whatever it might be, the lower end of the income spectrum or the higher end of the crime spectrum are doing worse than others, and the federal government should do something about it?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I think that it's actually more of a competition. We believe in tax competition, and people can vote with their feet and move to different cities or states. And I think that a lot of these economic policies right now are being enacted more on the state level. Opportunity zones are enacted to attract different industries to different locations that may need more help, but those are done mostly on the state level. So far as the federal government hasn't gotten as involved in that as others. I mean, a lot of it then ends up being ridiculous tax breaks for giant corporations to move to my city versus yours. Amazon is moving in one of their headquarters across the river in Virginia, and the tax credits that they received were just ridiculous, as if Amazon, needed any benefits, because I think they're doing just fine these days.
Terry, Michael, been lovely to see you virtually again. Thanks for joining the show again. Stay free, stay safe over there in the United States of America. Hope it's not too long before I catch up with you again in person soon at some Liberty conference or other, but it's been great to have you with us. Thanks so much, Terry. Thank you, Michael. Calvin, stay with us. Delighted to be joined now by Zoe Strimpel, columnist at the Sunday Telegraph. Zoe, how are you? Very good evening to you. And Kristian Niemetz.
Good evening.
Good evening, Zoe. Great to have you with us. And Kristian Niemetz, who's our very own head of political economy here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. How are you, Kristian? Good to have you with us.
Hello, good to be back.
Zoe, let me start with you. Can you help me? Calvin's cheered me up a bit about levelling up, but what's your understanding of what it really means? Because I've got this nagging worry in my mind that it's just a code for yet more redistribution of money and resources and big government plans to build things to try and get the economy going, rather than the liberalisation of various different parts of the country in order to supercharge their growth. Do you understand what the levelling up agenda is that the government claims to be pursuing?
I mean, I don't particularly have a specialized purchase on what the government really is going to be doing or wants to be doing. But what I would say is that I get quite a strong impression with every new set of announcements and declarations that there's sort of a hell of a lot of sort of jargon that uses these sort of, go us cheerleadery type terms and phrases. But that, as you say, it's unclear if they're actually interested in or engaging at all with what actually underpins these kind of, yay, we're going to level up, we're going to build back better. I mean, the sound bites don't, as you say, really translate into something that one can really picture. So I'm afraid I'm kind of bewildered by much of the language that is being wheeled out as policy now. So I agree. I think you can say, you can try to inject as much as you can into regions, but if there's no innovation and there's no the stuff that actually fuels markets and actually fuels innovation, actually fuels the economy, I don't think it's an extremely almost sort of, it's a very statist, I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, very kind of old-fashioned left-wing way of doing things, where we can just keep injecting stuff in and hope that somehow lifts everyone up. But I think the real problem is, how are we going to get people to come up with interesting ideas for businesses, and then how are we going to not clobber them once they've had those ideas? Because we'll get into this, but something that I really don't really understand, coming from Boris of all people, is that I think there's actually just a lot of hoops that businesses seem to have to go through. So in the absence of an easy kind of commercial route to a kind of stronger, more distributed, leveled up economy, I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like. So yeah, I like you have my I'm generally just not sure what the nature of this government is at this point. I mean, it seems that there have been several personality changes that have been undergone. So it doesn't. I mean, the idea that what it stands for in terms of capitalism, markets, and so on, that political philosophy has been completely. It's not there. So I think that's a huge, bigger problem.
Okay, so where are you on this, Kristian? Can you do a better job of trying to get inside the head of the government and explain to me what it means? Calvin's quite upbeat about it. To him, this is as cool as leveling up his, I don't know, his wizard on his Dungeons and Dragons computer game or whatever it was he was comparing it to. Zoe, bit more cynical. I'm just confused. Kristian, are you able to explain what you think this program is, this philosophy is of leveling up?
No, I'm afraid it's not going to get any better. As far as I can tell, it's just a soundbite, a fancy way of saying regional policy, regional development policy. But in that regard, it is, of course, just a continuation of something that has always been going on. Every government seems to think that there hasn't been any regional development policy before, no attempts to move investment to particular regions. But that has, of course, always happened. Probably for I don't know, certainly more than 100 years. In that regard, there's nothing new about this. I mean, the only specific thing that I've seen is that there is a so-called leveling up fund, but that is just a label for infrastructure investment and town center regeneration. But again, these are fairly conventional policies, so I can't see what the new agenda here is. It is, of course, it's rhetorically very good. Leveling up suggests that you're trying to lift up the poorer regions rather than pulling down the more prosperous ones, and who could be against that? But in practice, you can't really distinguish so easily between the two, because whatever is going into that leveling up fund or some other related programs, these are resources which ultimately, if they're going into the poorer regions, you have to pull them out of the more prosperous regions. And you can call that leveling up or whatever you want, but that's just old-fashioned, straightforward redistribution.
Calvin, okay, a few challenges that I need to put back to you then. I mean, would your approach, Calvin, be more market orientated or business orientated, as sort of Zoe was suggesting, rather than this is just regional development policy that we're seeing at the moment, isn't it? I mean, with the Calvin Robinson government, rather than the Boris Johnson government, I don't know, setting up enterprise zones or making it easier in these regions to redesignate sites so you could change get around planning laws more easily if you wanted to close down that factory and make it into a nightclub or vice versa. Would you be going for a more liberalizing approach to help these areas that haven't done particularly well? I mean, some of the numbers are pretty stark. London is on productivity about 60% more productive than Wales. This is the UK's least productive region. The gap between richest and poorest regions in the UK is almost twice as large as the gap between richest and poorest regions in France, and about 3/4 larger than the gap between richest and poorest in Germany. But Calvin, the reason I'm a bit pessimistic is I'd love to hear, I guess we've got free ports, but I'd love to hear more sort of enterprise zones or liberalizing measures to help places like Hartlepool, Rotherham, and the rest, rather than grand planning from Boris Johnson and his mates in Whitehall. Is my cynicism misplaced?
Probably not. I like to try and remain optimistic, but you're probably more realistic than I am. Kristian's right. We have seen these kinds of things before. The Northern Powerhouse was a big emphasis that kind of got dropped pretty quickly. There wasn't much practicality that came out of it. And Zoe's right in that this government doesn't seem to have an identity, or it's having an identity crisis. But I don't think that's down to Boris Johnson. I think that's down to the change in direction from Cummings to Simmons, most probably. But what I would like to see is levelling up everywhere. I would like to see more deregulation. You're right, free ports is great, but we need more deregulation across different industry sectors. We are going to see that in housing, we've been told. It was in the Queen's speech at least, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. But yes, level playing field for everyone, and good attention to regions outside of the M25. And you're all right, it's nothing new, but it does need to be an emphasis, it does need to be a focus, and it seems like it is, because now it's more important than it's ever been, for this government at least, as far as their vote share is concerned.
Calvin, you've helped me there. I wanted to segue to the Queen's speech, and we're going to get to it now. A whole plethora of different proposals in the Queen's speech. I think 30 or so bills rolled forward. I want to specifically focus in a few minutes on the health and care bill. But Zoe, what was your take on it as an overall package of measures, I guess, preparing for post-lockdown, when something like normality returns? We haven't really seen this government in any sort of normal situation. Firstly, we had getting Brexit done, and then we've had a year of the pandemic. Can you discern from the plethora of measures put forward, Zoe, what were the highlights or the lowlights for you, or the surprises?
Well, for me, I mean, I may pick up on things that aren't, like the planning thing didn't really, that's not really my passionate area, and even the health and the care stuff, which is huge, isn't what really, I mean, so to me, there's some very illiberal, worrying small things in here that aren't actually that small. So, okay, I'll take the sort of banning of junk food advertising entirely online and then before 9 p.m. on TV, which it's a huge grab on free speech. Advertising is a form of free speech. And obviously you can have some curbs on it, but this is completely insane. And it's coming from this frantic obsession with obesity, which is a problem, but you can tell that it's fueled by terror about what's going to happen to the NHS. So here and I've written about this several times, but here we have a populace that's being paid, actually, the fitness miles, whatever it's called, to try to lose weight. And then businesses who make junk food, which is perfectly legal and a part of, people can decide how much of it they want. They're now being, a huge part of their business and a huge part of advertising business. Now suddenly they can't do that. So that it is, it's an old trope, isn't it? The kind of nanny state gone mad. But I'm just shocked at how Boris, of all people, is delivering like such a huge amount of nannying. And then it's not, but it's more sinister than that. So I think because if we think about advertising as free speech, and this banning of advertising entirely online, to the point that you get these absurd sentences in news reports saying things like, but small companies, like it won't be illegal for small companies to tweet about brownies. And you're thinking, how is this the level of state intervention that we've arrived at? Because Boris was fat when he had COVID. I mean, it's mad. Obesity is incredibly complicated, and the way humans are complicated. And to think that, the way you're going to solve it is like taking away people's sort of choice is sad. That's the thing that underpins a lot of these measures, including the sort of online harm one to some degree, although that's maybe a little bit different. But this idea that people must all be controlled from the top down because we're too stupid. And, it's almost like, I understand there's a kind of balance to be struck between free will and agency and individual determination and, the fact that you live in a society. But the way it's going now, the balance is like we're all automatons. I mean, COVID may have helped with that, but we need to be, every string has to be pulled. So I'm like furious about that one. I think just briefly on this, and then by the way, the contradictions that, this is a huge grab on free speech, massive censorship. And on the other hand, you've got this like, universities free speech protection laws that student unions are going to have to ensure that speakers aren't no platformed and stuff. So it's sort of they think they're sort of doing free speech, but they're actually just making massive grabs for it as well. Online, again, this anti-business thing seems to go with this urge for censorship. So massive, tech companies being now held responsible for everything on their sites. So I find that very odd, because why stop there? I mean, why is anyone mean allowed to exist in the world? Like, there is bad stuff in the world, and technology sites are portals. They bring vast amount. It's a public space. So it's sort of obsessive control. Suddenly it's as for children being exposed to things, yes, okay, that's a problem. We don't want children out on the streets being exposed to bad things either. But it's insane. And then, this is my final, I'll shut up after this, but, just the very language that's being used. I mean, Oliver Dowden saying these are groundbreaking laws that will usher in a new age of accountability for tech and bring fairness and accountability to the online world, and also protecting children who are creating a truly democratic digital age. He's just throwing that around. Like, that makes literally no sense. There's nothing democratic about, also fairness, totally subjective, who's deciding what's fair. So I think the language is all jumbled up, meaningless, empty, and these rules are increasingly sort of worryingly censoring, I think, and then extremely interfering.
Do you think, Zoe, just very quickly, whether that they may now have gone so far that there will be a backlash, that it's kind of one thing, I guess you could argue, to, ban, I don't know, cigarette adverts from television. But when you've got a small family firm that now sort of, potentially is worried it's breaking the law if it promotes its own jam or whatever it might be, because do you think we might actually get to the stage where this has gone so far to include, because my understanding is the definition of junk food is extremely vague, right? It's not just hamburgers, it includes jam, or I think you were saying about brownies and cakes. Might you actually finally get a backlash here that people just say, this is ridiculous, these are very normal products, normal human activity to eat cake? The idea that you can't advertise it shouldn't be treated like cigarettes or alcohol. This is a very mainstream product. What the hell's going on? And someone will, no doubt get arrested for having, tried to sell jam on their Facebook page or whatever it might be.
I hope so. I mean, just really good point there with the vagueness. I mean, think of this term online harm. So even if something is legal, it can still not be banned from online because it's harmful. Again, these vague subjective words. So yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I don't see a backlash. I think the government it responds to some things, but it's so sanctimonious that it's not going to respond to things like that. The only thing the government seems to respond to on the kind of backlash front are when it's suddenly perceived to be being mean, like about school meals or whatever. But when it's something like anything in the domain of what would have formerly been like a socialist statist thing, the government is like, no, we're in the high ground for it. So I haven't heard anyone. I mean, I think there was supposed to be a consultation on this ban on junk food ads. I haven't heard any serious pushback against it. I'm worried that nobody is making the argument for why, because people just get distracted, and because we're in such a kind of push button, sentimental, it's politically correct. So all people have to say is, but obesity is like hurting children, or, bring in some sort of like push button thing like that. And then suddenly the other argument is kind of, anything slightly more sophisticated as a pushback is kind of completely off the table. So I think, the small businesses with their jam, I don't know. I mean, small businesses in COVID, gyms that tried to stay open despite lockdowns just got smacked with bigger and bigger fines. And the British public was I was fairly pro-lockdown actually, but there was no real support for that. So I just wonder if everybody is going to think, no, it's true. Like, obesity is the next, lung cancer or whatever. And I think the government, as I say, they're going to keep spinning it in such a way that they are unresponsive to backlash because Boris has this E-Day fix. I think in a way it's almost like this personal issue with him because of his own brush with death. So we're dealing with like a psychological thing here. But also I think the issue of the NHS, which is so perilous, and obesity, it's so vague. Obesity is so vague. It's different for different people. But because you can attribute it to such a panoply of problems, you could just say, okay, this will be I think they think, despite any backlash of small jam makers, because again, don't forget, I think this is quite an anti-business government. They're going to think, well, who can dispute our dear NHS? So again, the leftist agenda, the socialist agenda, it's about protecting our NHS, our health, our this, and it's hard to say, no, obesity, it's hard to push back against that because obesity is bad. So someone needs to be able to make the argument that you can still have freedom of choice for basic things in life, even if they're bad for you. And it's like we've gotten to the point that we just can't, nobody's making those arguments. The government's completely lost the ability to understand that. And that's worrying. And again, I think that's because of a lack of political philosophy. I don't think they know who they are.
I want to move on to the NHS in just a moment. But Kristian, let me come to you. An issue that you've been beating the drum on for many years now is on planning reform. And again, on the face of it, this sounds unbelievably tedious and technical. But in your studies and research to try and find out why the cost of living was so high, you reached the conclusion that strict planning laws are a really big part of it. We have too many laws against it being easy to build, not just domestic properties, commercial properties as well. Do you think the government has now grasped that nettle? Are we going to see planning liberalisation, Kristian, and therefore a fall in the cost of living? Or are the NIMBYs winning again and we're not going to see any meaningful reform?
Well, we've certainly seen the right rhetoric. The problem is just that we've seen that before. That was exactly what happened when Sajid Javid was planning minister. Sounded exactly like that, started with all the right intentions, and he was then slowed down, and ultimately his plans were derailed by his own colleagues. And a couple of years before that, the same thing happened when Nick Bowles was planning minister, also started with the right intention, right rhetoric. And it's one of those areas where I think most politicians know what to do. They know about the problem. They diagnose it correctly. But there is just they are terrified of picking a fight with the NIMBYs. And that's why you always get these planning proposals starting with all the right intentions, but they're hoping that somehow nobody will notice it and that you can just start building houses and nobody will really realize it. And then suddenly the houses are just there and housing is suddenly cheap. And then it always turns out, no, as soon as you get the first applications coming in, you do get resistance. People do blame the government. And then it becomes a situation where you just need a few outliers, a few who are willing to say, I'm standing up against this, I'm not having it, they're concreting over our lovely countryside, and then those politicians are the good guys, and then everybody else joins them, and that's how these plans always die. I mean, that they are making the right noises. Boris Johnson did say he wanted to make it harder for people to object housing development. And that's an unusual thing to say. Normally, you wouldn't phrase it in that way. You would just talk about, we are the builders, blah, blah, talk about it in abstract terms, but presented as if it was going to be universally popular. But he is already anticipating some backlash, and the fact that he puts it like that, that is in itself a good sign.
Yeah. Calvin, let me come back to you. What are you able to pick up on Zoe's point that there are mixed messages here? You know, freedom of speech on university campus, absolute principle we're going to stand up for. Freedom of speech for a company that makes jam, not so much. Actually, that's going to be clamped down on. Very difficult to discern from this what the overall sort of philosophy of Johnsonism is, I would argue. Kristian said, you know, that, all right, some modest moves on planning reform, but nothing particularly radical. What was your take on it, Calvin, as a package of measures? Does this move the country in the right direction, or is it just a ton of further centralisation and central planning?
I think there was a lot of good stuff in this Queen's speech, actually, but there is some mixed messaging. And on the point that Zoe raised about nanny statism and why are we heading in that direction, I think it's because people seem to want to be told what to do. If this last year has told us anything, it's that, unfortunately. And we are the ones that need to fight against it and champion freedom. But in regards to the higher education free speech bill, that's fantastic. Protecting free speech on campuses, great starting point to fight against cancel culture. But we need to make sure the government doubles down on that. So when you consider the online bill, risky ground, giving Ofcom new powers, I can see the benefits of that. If we go down the Polish route of finding social media companies that ban people that haven't broken the law, because we want to avoid censorship. What we don't want to do is give them the freedom to ban anything that's considered offensive. And that's the way it looks like it's going. So we need to lean on them and make sure that doesn't happen. There is a focus on duty of care, which as an educationalist, I find very, very important. You know, safeguarding children online is essential. We need to do more in that area. But it's not just about safeguarding children. There's also elements of, counter-terrorism stuff in there. And we know how that goes when you try to censor terrorism online. It's all very subjective. So social media companies do need to be held accountable. Last year we saw them censor the sitting president of the United States for goodness sake. And the big tech is at a point now where they are the controllers of information, much more so than mainstream media. So they do need to be held accountable. And we do need more legal methods of challenging them. But it's a fine line between that and censorship, which is what we need to do. This whole idea of banning high-fat ads online is ridiculous. And as Zoe said, it's going to affect small businesses just as much as big ones. And to them, I say, let them eat cake. Absolutely, with you on that, Mark. The telecommunications security bill is another one that we need to be careful of, because that's going to give the government new powers. Anything that gives the government new powers, we need to absolutely look at with a fine-tooth comb. But there was a lot of good stuff in the bill, some stuff around illegal immigrants and their rights to settle, the police and crime sentencing bill, which we discussed last time I was on here. Some good stuff in there, although again, there's curbs on protesting, which we need to be careful with. And easing regulations around planning, I thought was fantastic. But Kristian's touched that in much more articulate ground than I could. And then, of course, we've got all this environment and animal welfare stuff, which is the new Carrie Symonds brand of conservatism, keeping Carrie happy. Good news in that animal welfare is important, or should be important to all of us, but will it be addressed equally? Will we see halal slaughter be addressed at all by this government, or will they allow that while stamping down on everything else? We want equality under law, surely.
Before we finish, I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on one of the big parts of the Queen's speech, but the wider picture of it on health and social care. The Health and Care Bill includes a provision that the Health Secretary will have more power to intervene and set the direction of the health service. Is this more top-down reform, and looks like we're going to have sort of moving slowly but steadily towards nationalised social care, not just nationalised healthcare? I think I've already referred to this Fit Miles scheme. I haven't seen the details of it, but behind it is a concept that you're actually literally going to pay people to eat better food and to exercise more. Zoe, you wrote last year during the height of the clap for the NHS stuff that we're all supposed to turn up on our doorsteps at, when was it, 8 o'clock on Thursday night. I never did it myself. That we were dangerously mythologizing our NHS. Do you think this is ever going to change, or are we now just in a ratchet effect? Not only will the NHS stay unreformed, but the Health Secretary needs to have more power over it so he can dictate exactly how many bedpans are issued to each hospital. And more than that, he's got to have complete oversight of the entire social care of the country so he can work out exactly where to position his troops on the board. It looks like we're going to go not to a more marketized, liberalized system of healthcare, right, but to an even more centralized one with even more political intervention from the Secretary of State for Health. Would you not say so, Zoe?
I would, and I think this comes back again to the core problem underpinning all of my critiques and all of our collective unease, which is that nobody in this government is willing to stand up and clarify a philosophy that includes the market and that doesn't demonize capitalism and allows for a genuinely mixed system, and that trumpets what the market can do. And the fact that that is never addressed full on means that they've chosen the path instead of just going with the dominant narrative in this country, which is almost demented. But I mean, given that I'm fairly pro Britain in general, I'll take it. But as far as demented narratives go, there are worse ones than mythologizing of the health service. But it does suggest that there's, given that seeing as socially, even you say the word privatization or even the word insurance, deeply taboo thing to bring up. You don't want to do that over dinner. Well, it depends what circles you're in. And because the government are just not coming, they're going in every time they have a choice to push with something more, say, Thatcherite, or to push with something more, almost Corbynite. They go for the kind of Corbynite route. So no, I think this, and there's just no chance, because they're not willing to, because they have no cohesive philosophy about economics, really. They're never going to be in a position to make a convincing case for why the NHS needs massive amounts of reform, which a really gutsy prime minister would do, who had his philosophy down pat. Boris turns out not to be that one. As for making Matt like this health secretary of state control it all, it's definitely going in the wrong direction, and it's a direction that can't stand the test of time. And that's, I think, also linked to this terror of what obesity is going to do in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Social care, very aging population as well, obviously. So, I mean, I think that, part of a safety net, I'm happy to pay taxes. I don't mind having, a state social care, because, we don't want people, this is a civilized country. We can't have people kind of dying, old people sort of dying in undignified ways. But yes, no, I think there's no change to that. And I think just a final point, I mentioned Boris's own brush with death. I do think some of this is really down to the personalities of these people. And Matt Hancock is, someone should do a kind of in-depth sort of psychological profile of all of them. But I think he, his idea of controlling each trash can in each hospital and stuff, that's perfect for him. He hasn't really slept in 14 months. He's done this COVID crisis. He wants every bit of control. So it's partly about, failure to engage with what a mixed market blended approach could do for the NHS. It's the mythologization that makes it deeply unpopular, that would take a courageous politician. And it's Matt Hancock himself, who's like OCD about this stuff, I'm pretty
Kristian,
sure.
as well as being one of the public intellectuals who's been the big drumbeater for planning reform, you've also incurred the wrath of the wokerati through your supposedly highly controversial views on healthcare, where you have dared to say, you have blasphemed that there might be some evidence that perhaps the National Health Service isn't the absolutely perfect health system in every regard, and we might have something to learn from other countries. What's your thought about how the government is approaching your research on that one, Kristian? We're just doubling down on more and more nationalisation of healthcare, more and more centralisation, and indeed bringing social care within that ambit, aren't we?
It looks that way at the moment, yes. I've always said I wouldn't start from here. If it were up to me, we wouldn't have a national health service in the first place. We would have a universal private insurance system. But I've also said that if we have a system like that, and if that is unchangeable, if that is set in stone, then at least the direction of travel we've been in the last 2 decades was broadly the right one, where successive governments tried to get out of the day-to-day running of the National Health Service, give it more independence and give more independence to individual healthcare providers. And that's been the direction of travel for 2 decades, since the second term of Tony Blair, depoliticizing it to the extent that you can in a system like that. And now they are reversing that. This is really unexpected. And this sort of re-centralization is, I think, going to play badly for the government, even on its own terms. They're probably doing it because for 10 years they've been accused of having secret plans to privatize the NHS. It was first under the coalition government with the Health and Social Care Act 2012. All the newspapers saying this is the privatization of the NHS through the back door, and then that was forgotten. And then the same story came back under the guise of a post-Brexit deal with a trade deal with the US. Then the narrative became they're selling the NHS to Donald Trump. That is the way they're getting rid of it. Now Donald Trump has gone away as well, and but the idea that there's some secret plan to privatize the NHS isn't going away. I think that this re-centralization, maybe they were thinking that will finally diffuse that criticism. Now our opponents can't possibly say that anymore. The thing is, they absolutely can. It's because it's mostly technical changes. Nobody fully understands them. And what happens then is somebody will say, oh, this is about secret privatization. And you get those headlines again, like every time.
Nobody ever explained to me, Kristian, why Donald Trump would want to buy the NHS, even if we were willing to sell it to him, right? But
not even sure he knows what the NHS is.
No, and probably cares less. Kelvin, let me finish with you. What's your view of where we've got to on the healthcare debate? I mean, there's a whole range, a plethora of different views here, but my biggest regret is it seems we can't have a grown-up and adult debate about it. We're all supposed to wave flags and clap on our doorstep, and any suggestion that the National Health Service is anything other than immaculate and perfect and the envy of the world, you're shut down immediately, you're criticised for wanting worse outcomes and the rest of it. Is there any way that we can start, Kelvin, to have a serious discussion about maybe we've got something to learn from the rest of the world when it comes to healthcare provision, rather than only things to teach the rest of the world? We're supposed to believe that Johnny Foreigner just looks at us green with envy that we have a National Health Service and never ask ourselves the question why other countries haven't just replicated our system if it's that good. But is there any chance of even beginning to have a debate about this on a serious level, even if policy change isn't imminent?
Absolutely. We need some of our politicians to get some balls and just tell us how it is. The NHS at this past year has shown that it's not fit for purpose. I'm absolutely sick of it. It's become a religion at this point. You have to idolize the NHS and anyone who works for the NHS. They do a very good job, the people who work for it, but the institution as a whole doesn't work. We've seen that. We've thrown money at it and it does not work. So I'm all for privatizing the NHS at this point. The health secretary himself, I think, is a megalomaniac. This power grab in the Queen's speech is very worrying. We've got 80+ majority Conservative government. It's time for them to do something Conservative and stop being afraid of this vocal minority that we call the woke mob. But to end on a positive, there's two other things that I forgot to mention. The Fixed Term Parliament Act is getting repealed, and voter ID is getting introduced. Two positives from the Queen's speech there.
Well, just very quickly, Calvin, why are those positive? What meaningful difference will that make to anything?
Well, voter ID, we can cut down on voter fraud, and that we've been wanting to do that for a long, long time. I don't know the numbers offhand because I hadn't prepped for that, but it's about time we did something about the postal vote fraud, as well as the people that turn up who aren't registered to vote, that are already on the electoral roll. We're talking a lot of illegal immigrants that are on the roll that shouldn't be on the roll, and all this kind of stuff. Cut all that out. And it's been, for so long, the left have been saying it's racist to suggest that people need to bring voter ID, which I think is a patronising argument somehow that ethnic minority people can't get ID. And the stats around it actually show that ethnic minority people are more likely to actually own ID, so it's a nonsense argument anyway. But the Fixed Term Parliament Act has, that was ridiculous. We want to be in a position where we can call an election when we need one, when the government feels that one is needed. Hopefully we won't have one too soon, because we have far too many over the last 5 years anyway. But it's a bill that needed to go, and finally the Conservative government said, okay, we're going to repeal it and get rid of another Tony Blairism.
On that upbeat note, Calvin, Kristian, Zoe, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Really appreciated hearing your views and analysis. My thanks too to Terry, Kibbe and Michael Carnuccio, who joined us earlier on the programme. Thanks to all of you for watching. We're taking a week off from Live with Littlewood next week, but at 6 p.m. next Wednesday, be sure to come to the IEA London YouTube channel, where you can watch the official launch of our latest project, the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity. Tomorrow at 5 p.m, we've got our newest episode of The Swift Half with Snowden, the discussion show with my colleague Chris Snowden. And this week, I kid you not, he has an extraordinarily special guest who you might not ever really expect to see on an IEA video. I won't tell you who it is. You'll have to wait 22 hours for that, unless you are an IEA online patron. You can support us over on the Patreon platform. This is where we've set up a membership platform that allows our followers to donate solely towards our digital work, while subscribing as an online patron to exclusive IEA perks, benefits, priority access to content. So if you are one of our patrons, you can go and see the Chris Snowden show with his extra special guest now. So thanks again to all of our guests. Thanks to all of our new online patrons who've signed up and pledged their support towards that. I'd like to personally give a big shout out to who have just signed up to our VIP tier. A massive thank you for Timothy Worrell and Mark Edwards for your support and generosity. Really appreciate it. I'll be back on May the 24th at 5 p.m. in conversation with Liam Fox. And I'd also encourage you to sign up for our Think conference on the 12th of June, a virtual conference. Tickets are free, but you do need to register in advance. Great lineup of speakers, including Tim Harford, Vince Cable, Matthew McCaffrey, and Juliet Samuel. If you are watching us on YouTube and have enjoyed the show, please give us the thumbs up. If you're not yet a subscriber, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Stay safe, stay free, have a good night. Over and out.